At 42 minutes past midnight, on the 8th of March, 2014, a Boeing 777 left Kuala Lumpur International Airport, bound for Beijing. There were 239 people on board, 227 passengers, and 12 crew. They came from 14 countries. 153 of them were Chinese, 38 were Malaysian, and all 12 of the crew were Malaysian. There were 7 Indonesians, 6 Australians, 5 Indians, 4 French, 3 Americans, 2 Canadians, 2 New Zealanders, 2 Ukrainians, 2 Iranians, 1 Russian, 1 Dutchman, 1 Taiwanese. Nobody has ever found them or the aircraft they were on. I want to say that once, at the beginning, plainly, and then set it slightly to one side, because the reason we are telling this story tonight is not the loss. It is what a small number of engineers did afterwards. They took a log file, a record of automated housekeeping messages that a satellite had exchanged with the aircraft, kept for no particular reason, containing no position information of any kind. And from the timing of those messages, they worked out roughly where an aeroplane nobody could see had gone. That is one of the more remarkable pieces of inference of this century, and almost nobody can tell you how it was done. Tonight, we are going to do that properly. But first, the flight. The aircraft was a Boeing 777-200ER, registration 9MMRO. Malaysia Airlines had taken delivery of it in May of 2002, so it was not quite 12 years old, young for a wide body. It had flown a little over 53,000 hours across roughly 7,500 flights. There were no outstanding defects of any significance. It was, in every respect available to us, an ordinary aeroplane on an ordinary night. Here is the timeline. I am going to give it to you carefully because everything that follows depends on it. The flight departs at 42 minutes past midnight, Malaysian time. At 6 minutes past 1, the aircraft's maintenance system sends a routine engine data report by satellite, the kind of automatic message that goes out every half hour and that nobody reads unless something is wrong. Nothing is wrong. That system is called ACARS, and it is worth understanding because its silence is the first thing that was wrong. ACARS is a data link, a way for the aircraft to send short operational messages to the airline automatically. Engine performance, fuel state, position reports, maintenance flags. It runs in the background for the whole flight, and it reports on a schedule. The next report was due at 37 minutes past 1. It never came. At 19 minutes and 30 seconds past 1, Kuala Lumpur Air Traffic Control hands the flight over to Vietnamese airspace. The controller gives the frequency for Ho Chi Minh, and the cockpit answers, "Good night, Malaysian 370. I want to pause on those 5 words because you have probably heard different ones. For the first 3 weeks after the disappearance, the world was told the final transmission had been all right. Good night. A slightly casual, slightly off sign-off, and a great deal was read into it. On the 31st of March, 2014, Malaysia released the actual transcript. The real wording was, "Good night, Malaysian 370, which is, if anything, more standard than the version that had been reported. It is the correct phraseology. It is what a professional crew says. The Malaysian authorities confirmed there was nothing abnormal in the transcript and offered no explanation for why the wrong wording had been circulating for 3 weeks. I mention this now early because a lot of material about this flight treats that discrepancy as sinister. It is not. It is an early days information failure, of the kind that will define the next chapter entirely. In the first fortnight after this aircraft vanished, a very large number of things were said in public that turned out not to be so. At 21 minutes and 13 seconds past 1, the transponder stops. A transponder is the device that makes an aircraft legible to civilian radar. It broadcasts identity, altitude, a code. Without it, an aircraft is not invisible, but it becomes a bare return on a primary radar screen, an unidentified blip with no name attached. It is worth separating the two kinds of radar here, because the difference explains the whole night. Secondary radar is a conversation. The ground station interrogates, the aircraft's transponder answers, and the answer carries identity and altitude. It is how controllers actually track traffic, the labeled targets on the screen, each with a call sign beside it. Primary radar is older and dumber. It transmits a pulse and looks for a reflection. It does not ask anything, and nothing answers. It sees an object, and it sees roughly where the object is, and that is all. Civil air traffic control largely relies on the first. Military air defense keeps the second running, because an aircraft that does not want to be identified will not answer an interrogation. When the transponder stopped, the aircraft did not vanish. It stopped being a name and became a shape. The aircraft was over a waypoint called IGARI, out in the Gulf of Thailand, at the boundary between Malaysian and Vietnamese airspace. It was between two countries' air traffic control, in the handover gap, at the moment the transponder ceased. And then, within about a minute, it turned left. Not a gentle drift. A turn back, reversing course, taking the aircraft across the Malay Peninsula it had just flown over, from the Gulf of Thailand on the eastern side, over the land, and out into the Strait of Malacca on the western side. Malaysian military primary radar tracked it doing this. At 52 minutes past 1, it crossed Penang Island. At 3 minutes past 2, it passed a small island called Pulau Perak. At 22 minutes past 2, roughly 237 nautical miles northwest of Penang, near a waypoint called Makar, it went off the edge of radar coverage. And that is the last time anybody saw Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 by any means on any screen. Two things about that turn before we move on. The first is that the 2018 Malaysian Safety Investigation Report concluded it was flown manually, not by autopilot, not by an automated system responding to a failure. Somebody, or something, moved the controls. That single finding does a great deal of work. It rules out most purely mechanical accounts, and it rules out remote interference. It does not, and the report is explicit about this, identify who was at the controls. The second is about the radar. The military had that track on the night. It showed an aircraft crossing the country from east to west, at a time when the entire region was searching the South China Sea. It was not publicly acknowledged for several days. Search and rescue was activated at 5:30 in the morning, Malaysian time, about 4 hours after the last contact. The search began where you would expect it to begin, along the filed flight plan, the Gulf of Thailand and the South China Sea. On the route the aircraft should have been flying toward Beijing. Vessels and aircraft from Malaysia, Vietnam, China, Singapore, Thailand, Indonesia, the Philippines, Australia, and the United States converged on that water and began looking. It is difficult to convey how much water that is. The South China Sea alone is about 3.5 million square kilometers. Searching it from the air means flying grid patterns at a few hundred meters, looking down at a moving surface for objects that may be the size of a suitcase, in conditions where a white cap and a piece of debris are the same thing at a distance. Even when you are looking in exactly the right place, ocean surface search is close to the hardest thing aviation asks anyone to do. For 4 days, dozens of ships and aircraft searched a sea the aeroplane had already left before anyone noticed it was missing. I want to be careful about the tone there, because it would be easy to make that sound like farce. And it was not. Everybody involved was acting on the best information they had. The problem was that the best information they had was a flight plan, and the aircraft had stopped following it about 40 minutes after takeoff. And there is a structural reason it took 4 days rather than 4 hours to work that out. The military radar data was not sitting on a controller's screen waiting to be read. It was recorded. Somebody had to go and look at it, recognize that an unidentified primary return crossing the peninsula at 1 in the morning was worth attention, and connect it to a civilian airliner that had gone missing over a different sea. That is an act of interpretation made across 2 organizations that do not normally talk to each other, at a moment when everyone involved reasonably expected the aircraft to be found in the Gulf of Thailand at any minute. The first fortnight was, by any reasonable account, chaotic. There were oil slicks sighted off the Vietnamese coast within 48 hours, and reported as possible first evidence. They were sampled and analyzed, and the laboratory found they were not aircraft engine oil and not hydraulic fluid. They were shipping residue, the ordinary discharge of a heavily trafficked sea. There were satellite images. On the 12th and 13th of March, China released imagery showing 3 floating objects, the largest of them roughly 24 meters by 22, about the size of a wing section. Malaysian maritime aircraft were sent to the coordinates. There was nothing there. China subsequently said the images had been released by mistake. I want to be fair about that, because it sounds worse than it probably was. Satellite imagery of open ocean is full of ambiguous returns. Containers, whales, wave patterns, cloud shadow. Somebody looked at 3 bright objects in the right general area, at roughly the right time, and made a judgment that turned out to be wrong. And the judgment was published before it was checked. That pattern, publish first, verify later, is the through line of the entire first fortnight, and it is why the families of those 239 people spent weeks being told things that were then withdrawn. Through late March, there were further satellite sightings in the Southern Ocean, Australian, Chinese, French. Objects were photographed. Ships were diverted. Nothing was ever recovered. Everything that was eventually identified turned out to be ordinary marine litter, of which the Southern Indian Ocean has a great deal. And underneath all of this, there was a diplomatic quarrel. China criticized Malaysia's handling of information, publicly and repeatedly, and with 153 Chinese citizens on board, with real standing to do so. Malaysia's position was that China's own satellite release had made things worse. Both criticisms are documented. Neither has ever been adjudicated. Then, on the 12th of March, the search moved west to the Strait of Malacca and the Andaman Sea, as the military radar track was finally acknowledged. And on the 17th, it moved again to the southern Indian Ocean, on the strength of something nobody outside a small number of engineers had even known existed. That is the next chapter. The surface search that followed ran from the 18th of March to the 28th of April. 19 vessels, 345 military aircraft sorties, more than 4.5 million square kilometers of ocean surface. They found nothing at all. 4.5 million square kilometers is roughly the area of the European Union. It was covered by 19 ships and a few hundred aircraft sorties over 6 weeks, which gives you a sense of how thin that coverage necessarily was, and of how much of the ocean can be looked at without anything being seen. The 2018 Malaysian report is genuinely critical about the response, and it is worth saying what it actually criticized, because it is not what people assume. It documents that Kuala Lumpur air traffic control's attempts to re-establish contact were ineffective, and that there was a delay in declaring the emergency phase. It makes safety recommendations directed at air traffic control procedure, at the mechanics of noticing that an aircraft has stopped answering and escalating it. That is the institutional finding, not a conspiracy, a coordination failure of the sort that looks obvious afterwards and is genuinely difficult in the moment when an aircraft has gone quiet in a handover gap between two countries at 1 in the morning, and the most likely explanation, overwhelmingly, is a radio problem. By the end of that first fortnight, here is what was known. An aircraft had turned around, flown back across a country, and gone out over the Strait of Malacca. It had then flown off the edge of every radar screen in the region. Beyond that point, there was nothing. No radar, no radio, no distress call, no emergency beacon, no wreckage, no oil, nothing. An aeroplane with 239 people on it had gone somewhere, and the whole apparatus of modern aviation, a system built entirely around always knowing where the aeroplanes are, had no idea where. Except that there was one more thing, and nobody had thought of it because it was never designed to be useful. The aircraft carried a satellite communications terminal, a system for sending data and making calls through a satellite rather than through ground radio. It talked to a spacecraft called Inmarsat 3F1, sitting in geostationary orbit above the Indian Ocean at 64.5 degrees east. Now, a satellite communications network has a housekeeping problem. It needs to know which terminals are still switched on and logged in. So periodically, if a terminal has been quiet, the ground station sends it an interrogation. Essentially, are you still there? And the terminal replies, essentially, yes. That exchange is called a handshake. It contains no position, no altitude, no heading, no speed. It is a network keeping its own records tidy. And the ground station in Perth logged every one of them as a matter of routine, because that is what ground stations do. At 25 minutes past 2 in the morning, Malaysian time, 3 minutes after the aircraft went off military radar, the satellite terminal on board logged back on. It had been silent since around the time the maintenance reporting stopped, an hour earlier, and then it reconnected. And after that, for 6 more hours, it answered the hourly interrogation 7 times. The last transmission was a partial one. At 19 minutes and 37 seconds past midnight, Coordinated Universal Time, which is 8:15 in the morning in Malaysia. The aircraft's scheduled arrival in Beijing was an hour later. So, 7 timestamps, no position data whatsoever. Here is what 4 engineers at Inmarsat did with them. Their names are Chris Ashton, Alan Schuster Bruce, Gary College, and Mark Dickinson. And they published the method in the Journal of Navigation in 2014. I think they should be considerably more famous than they are. The first thing they used is called the burst timing offset, and the way to understand it is as an echo. The ground station sends its interrogation up to the satellite. The satellite relays it down to the aircraft. The aircraft replies, and the reply comes back the same way. The ground station knows precisely when it expects that reply, because it knows exactly where the satellite is and how fast radio waves travel. The reply always arrives slightly late, and that lateness, measured in millionths of a second, is the extra distance the signal had to cover, because the aircraft was not directly beneath the satellite. It was somewhere off to one side, and the signal had to go further to reach it. So one handshake gives you one number, and that number gives you a distance from the satellite. But a distance from a single fixed point in space, projected down onto the surface of the Earth, does not give you a position. It gives you a ring, a circle drawn on the globe, thousands of kilometers around, every single point on it exactly as consistent with the measurement as every other point. The aircraft was somewhere on that ring. That is all the number can say. 7 handshakes, 7 rings. And the last one, the one at 19 minutes past midnight, the final partial transmission, is the one that matters most, because it is the last thing the aircraft ever said. That last ring is what everybody now calls the 7th arc. There is a detail here that I think is the most quietly astonishing part of the whole story. The burst timing offset was never specified as a measurement. It was not a feature. Nobody designed the system so that this number would mean anything in the physical world. It existed as an internal timing value, a byproduct. So before they could use it, the engineers had to work out what it actually corresponded to. They calibrated it using logged values from the same aircraft, 9 mmRO, sitting on the ground at Kuala Lumpur, where the true distance to the satellite was known exactly. And from that aircraft's earlier flights, where the position was known from other sources, they reverse engineered a ruler out of a timestamp that had never been intended as one. Now the second problem, and it is a serious one. Every one of those rings crosses the Earth twice, once running up through Asia, and once running down into the southern Indian Ocean. The distance measurement cannot tell them apart. On timing alone, the aircraft could have flown north over Kazakhstan, or south into some of the emptiest water on the planet. Those are extremely different conclusions, and for a fortnight, nobody could rule out either. What separated them was the Doppler effect. You know the Doppler effect, even if not by that name. It is what happens to the sound of a siren as an ambulance passes you. The pitch is higher coming toward you and drops as it goes away. The source is moving, so the waves arrive squeezed together or stretched apart, and the frequency shifts. Radio does exactly the same thing. An aircraft transmitting while moving at 500 knots shifts the frequency of its own signal by an amount that depends on how fast it is going and in which direction relative to the satellite. The terminal on board tries to correct for this. It applies a compensation, so its transmissions arrive at the expected frequency. But its compensation is built on an assumption that the satellite is exactly where it is supposed to be, parked motionless over the equator. Inmarsat 3F1 was not quite motionless. It had drifted slightly in its orbital inclination, as aging satellites do, and was tracing a small figure of 8 against the sky. So the compensation was slightly wrong, and what was left over, the residual error, called the burst frequency offset, depended on where the aircraft was, how fast it was going, which way it was pointing, and where the satellite happened to be in its wobble at that instant. So they modeled it. They took candidate flight paths, north and south, and calculated what frequency residual each one would have produced at each of the 7 handshakes. Then they compared those predictions against what had actually been logged. The southern routes fitted. The northern routes did not. On the 24th of March, 2014, the Prime Minister of Malaysia announced that the flight had ended in the southern Indian Ocean. There was no wreckage. There was no radar. There was no witness. There were 7 timestamps and a Doppler residual on a frequency nobody had ever intended to measure. I want to be honest about the limits of this, because the episode is stronger for it, and because the engineers themselves were careful. The frequency method was never designed for navigation, and its error budget is genuinely wide. Change your assumptions about the satellite's position, or about how the terminal's internal oscillator drifted with temperature, and the answer moves. And the 7th arc is a line, not a point. The timing fixes distance from the satellite, and nothing else. Where along that arc the aircraft came down depends entirely on assumptions about its speed and heading through those 6 silent hours. And the satellite data contains no information about either. Every proposed crash site is a model laid on top of a measurement. The final 2 transmissions, 8 seconds apart, are the most argued over data in the entire file. Analysis of their frequency values implies a descent rate somewhere between about 2,900 and 6,800 feet per minute at the first, rising to between 13,800 and 17,600 feet per minute at the second. That is a steep descent, getting steeper. It is also an inference drawn from 2 numbers, and there are published reconstructions in the same journal that read them differently. On the 29th of July, 2015, 16 months and 21 days after the aircraft disappeared, a man cleaning a beach on Réunion Island in the western Indian Ocean east of Madagascar found a piece of aeroplane. It was about 2 meters long. It was a flaperon, a control surface from the trailing edge of a wing, which works as both a flap and an aileron. It was heavily encrusted with goose barnacles. Confirming what it was took longer than you might expect, because the manufacturer's data plate, the part that would simply have told them, was missing. The piece went to a French defense testing establishment in Toulouse. There, investigators found identification numbers stamped on internal components. and traced those numbers back through manufacturing records to the subcontractor in Spain that had built the flaperon. Those records linked those specific internal parts to one specific airframe. 9 MMRO. French judicial authorities confirmed the identification in September 2015. Malaysia had announced it as confirmed somewhat earlier, in early August, which was ahead of the formal French finding. A small thing, but part of a pattern by then. It is worth pausing on how that identification was actually made, because it is a small masterpiece of ordinary industrial record-keeping. A modern airliner is assembled from parts made by dozens of subcontractors, and every significant component carries a number stamped into the metal. Those numbers are recorded against the airframe they were fitted to, and the records are kept for the working life of the aircraft. Decades. So when the data plate was gone, the investigators went inside the structure, read the numbers off components that had never been meant to be seen again, and looked them up. Nobody designed that system as a way of identifying wreckage. It exists so that maintenance engineers can trace a faulty batch. It worked anyway. Over the following years, roughly 30 more pieces were recovered, along the coasts of Mozambique, South Africa, and Tanzania, and on islands including Réunion, Mauritius, Rodrigues, and Madagascar. The Australian Transport Safety Bureau's accounting, in 2017, examined 20 items. 18 were identified as very likely or almost certain to have come from the aircraft. 2 more were assessed as probably from it. And here is the detail I keep coming back to. Almost every one of those pieces was found by a beachcomber, a fisherman, a hotel worker, a tourist walking along a shore. Not one piece of MH370 has ever been found by an organized search. Every fragment came from a shoreline, found by somebody who was not looking for it. There is a reason for that, and it is about how the Indian Ocean moves. The gyre in that part of the world runs broadly westward at those latitudes, so anything floating from the search area drifts across thousands of kilometers of empty water toward Africa and the island chains east of Madagascar. And it takes well over a year to get there. By the time the debris arrived, the organized search had long since moved underwater, thousands of kilometers away, looking down. Now, what do you do with a piece of debris on a beach? You run the ocean backwards. Australia's National Science Agency, the CSIRO, took on this problem, led by an oceanographer named David Griffin. The question was, given where debris arrived and when it arrived, and just as importantly, where it conspicuously did not arrive, where must it have entered the water? Their first analysis, in 2016, pointed at a stretch of the 7th arc between about 36 and 32 degrees south, with the strongest indication near 35 degrees. But there was a problem with it, and the way they solved it is my favorite thing in this episode. To model how debris drifts, you need to know how that specific object behaves in water, how much of it sits above the surface, how the wind pushes it, whether it sails or simply floats. So they built replica flaperons and set them adrift to measure it. The replicas drifted wrong. The numbers did not reconcile. So CSIRO obtained a genuine Boeing 777 flaperon, and they cut it, deliberately damaged it to match the damage on the piece found at Réunion, and they put it in the ocean and watched what it did. It behaved quite differently from the replicas. It sailed about 20 degrees to the left of the wind, and it moved faster. And once that real-world behavior was fed into the model, the flaperon's arrival at Réunion in July 2015 fell into place. Their April 2017 report identified a most likely origin near 35.6 degrees south, 92.8 degrees east. The other half of that analysis is the part people miss, and it is arguably the more powerful half. The place's debris did not wash up. If the aircraft had entered the water further north, some fragments should have reached the Western Australian coast and reached it earlier. Australia has a long, well-populated, frequently walked coastline facing that ocean. Nothing was ever found on it. An absence in a model like this is evidence. It excludes possibilities just as firmly as an arrival confirms them. There is a second method, and it is stranger still. The barnacles. The flaperon came ashore, carrying several generations of stalked goose barnacles of a species called Lepas anatifera. A barnacle builds its shell out of calcium carbonate, laid down in increments as it grows, and the ratio of oxygen isotopes locked into each increment depends on the temperature of the water at the moment that layer formed, which means a barnacle shell is a thermometer with a clock in it, a running record of the sea temperatures the object drifted through in order. The definitive work on this was published in 2023. The researchers grew Lepas barnacles at known, controlled temperatures to establish, for the first time experimentally, exactly how the isotope ratio in that species relates to water temperature. Then they applied that calibration to the barnacles from the flaperon. The reconstruction indicated growth beginning in warm water, 26 to 27 degrees, and then shifting into cooler water, around 23 to 24. And it placed the drift path considerably further south than an earlier isotope study had suggested. Both of these methods are genuinely clever, and neither of them is a location. Drift modeling constrains a region and a timing, probabilistically. It cannot produce a point, because ocean currents at that scale are chaotic, and small errors compound over 16 months. The barnacles give a temperature history, which maps to a band of latitude, and many places in the Indian Ocean share a temperature. The largest barnacles, which would have recorded the earliest and most diagnostic period, were not preserved for analysis, and converting shell growth into elapsed time carries real uncertainty of its own. These are constraints. They narrow the arc. They do not end it. The underwater search began in October 2014 and ran until January 2017. Australian-led, with Malaysian and Chinese contribution. It covered 120,000 square kilometers of seabed along the seventh arc, at depths reaching 6,000 meters. Water deep enough that the pressure at the bottom is around 600 times what you are sitting in now. It cost about $155 million, which makes it the most expensive search in the history of aviation. It was suspended on the 17th of January, 2017, with the search area exhausted and nothing found. Then, in 2018, a seabed survey company called Ocean Infinity made Malaysia an unusual offer. No find, no fee. They would search at their own cost and be paid only if they located the wreckage. They used a vessel carrying 8 autonomous underwater vehicles, robot submarines that fly program patterns above the seabed, mapping it with sonar, and worked from January to the 9th of June, covering more than 112,000 square kilometers. much of it further north than the earlier zone. They found nothing. No fee was paid. And then it started again, which is the part most accounts have not caught up with. Malaysia signed a fresh, no fine, no fee agreement with Ocean Infinity, worth up to $70 million, payable only on success. A first phase ran for 4 days in late March 2025. A second phase ran from the last day of 2025 to the 23rd of January this year, working a region of the 7th arc around 34 degrees south. Across both phases, 28 days actually on task, and about 7,500 square kilometers of seabed surveyed. Weather in the southern Indian Ocean disrupted operations repeatedly. On the 8th of March this year, the 12th anniversary, Ocean Infinity announced the campaign had concluded. The Malaysian government statement was that the search activities undertaken had not yielded any findings confirming the location of the wreckage. As I record this, the aircraft has not been found. The vessel has been reassigned. The southern winter has closed the weather window, and Voice 370, the Families Association, has publicly asked for the contract to be extended without hesitation and for more contractors to be engaged on the same terms. So what happened? There are 2 accounts. I'm going to give you both, and I am not going to choose between them because the evidence does not. The first is an unresponsive crew and an uncontrolled end of flight. This is broadly the Australian Bureau's position. It rests on 3 things. The final 2 satellite transmissions imply that steep and accelerating descent. Boeing ran 10 simulations of how a 777 behaves after fuel exhaustion with nobody touching the controls, and several reproduced descent rates in that range. And the right outboard wing flap, recovered off Tanzania, was assessed as having been retracted at the moment it hit the water, which is not how you configure an aircraft for a deliberate ditching. The second account is controlled flight to the end, that somebody was flying it deliberately until it entered the water. Its most prominent advocate is a former Canadian accident investigator who reads the damage on the flaperon's trailing edge as consistent with a low-speed ditching underpower with the flaps extended. Others have argued the debris suggests the landing gear was down. Notice what is happening there. Both accounts are built on the same recovered pieces, examined by different qualified people, reaching opposite conclusions about something as basic as whether the flaps were down. That is the actual state of this evidence. The Malaysian Safety Investigation Report was released on the 30th of July, 2018, 495 pages. Its team leader, Kok Suchon, said this: "The team is unable to determine the real cause of the disappearance of MH370. The report states that the possibility of intervention by a third party cannot be excluded. It says investigators could not determine whether the aircraft was flown by anyone other than the pilots, and it is explicit that no plausible failure of the aircraft or its systems could be identified without the wreckage and the flight recorders." Which brings me to the part I want to handle carefully. There has been an enormous amount written about the captain of this flight. A great deal of it concerns his private life, his state of mind, and his politics. Much of it is sourced to anonymous officials, and a good deal of it has been repeated so often that it now reads as established. It is not established. So let me tell you what the investigations actually found. The 2018 report examined both pilots and all cabin crew and found no prior health issues, no behavioral issues, and no financial issues. It found no evidence of personal problems or motive that could account for the diversion. The Australian Bureau, in 2018, publicly declined to endorse a deliberate act conclusion, restating that its own analysis pointed to an unresponsive crew. There is one specific matter that comes up constantly, and it deserves a straight answer. The captain had a flight simulator at home, built on consumer software. The FBI examined its drives and recovered deleted data points, dated to around early February 2014, describing a route out over the southern Indian Ocean, ending in fuel exhaustion. That is real. And it happened. And I am not going to pretend otherwise. Here is what the authorities who examined it said about it. Australia's Coordination Centre stated that the recovered route did not prove any intention to steer the aircraft off course and showed only the possibility of planning. Malaysian officials noted the simulator contained thousands of destinations and that there was no evidence he had flown that route or deliberately crashed anything. So, a set of deleted coordinates was recovered from a hobbyist's hard drive. The route resembles one the aircraft may have flown, and every single authority that examined it declined to say that it meant anything. That is the record. I am going to leave it there, because that is where the evidence leaves it, and because the man cannot answer, and his family is alive. So here is where we are, 12 years on. An aircraft turned around over the Gulf of Thailand, flew back across a country, went out into the Indian Ocean, and flew south for 6 hours. We know that not because anyone saw it, but because a communications satellite kept a log of automated messages, and 4 engineers worked out that the lateness of those messages was a distance, and that the leftover frequency error was a direction. That inference has held up for 12 years. Every piece of debris that has since washed ashore, 30-odd fragments, on beaches thousands of kilometers apart, has been consistent with it. 2 entirely independent methods, drift modeling and the isotope chemistry of barnacle shells, both point back to broadly the same stretch of ocean. And the aircraft is not there. Or it is. And 232,000 square kilometers of sonar survey have passed over it without seeing it, which on that seabed, at that depth, is entirely possible. I find I keep returning to the shape of the thing. The 7th arc is a line drawn across the sea by arithmetic. It is derived from 7 timestamps that were recorded by accident, by a system doing its bookkeeping at hourly intervals, while an aeroplane that no one on Earth could see flew on through the dark. It is the best line anybody has. It is still just a line. 239 people were on that aircraft, and their families have been waiting 12 years for something more definite than a curve on a chart. Sleep well.